I hope you're enjoying this small group series on why study the Old Testament. So far, we've seen that the Old Testament often seems very distant from modern life. After all, it was written by people and for people who lived thousands of years ago. This is precisely why understanding much of the Old Testament requires us to work very hard. There are many theological, cultural, and personal distances between ourselves as modern Christians and the Old Testament. This sense of distance is evident time and again. But we're about to see that as followers of Christ, we should nonetheless confidently affirm that the Old Testament is tremendously relevant for our lives.
Now that we've acknowledged the causes and kinds of distance that separate the Old Testament from us, we should turn to our second topic, the relevance of the Old Testament for modern people. If the Old Testament was written so long ago, why should we have any expectation that it's still relevant for us today?
There are countless reasons why Christians should expect the Old Testament to have significance for their lives. But perhaps the most important piece of evidence comes from Jesus and his first-century apostles and prophets. These men confidently taught that the Old Testament was not simply God's authoritative word for ancient Israel, but that it was God's word for Christians in their day as well. Many Christians today believe that the New Testament was given to do away with the Old Testament. But in reality, Jesus and his apostles and prophets said just the opposite. They taught that the Old Testament is crucial for faithful Christian living in every age.
The New Testament teaches in many places that the Old Testament has relevance for our lives. But we'll look in just two directions. First, we'll look at some of the teachings of Jesus, and second, we'll consider some of the teachings of the Apostle Paul. Let's think first about Jesus' teachings regarding the Old Testament's relevance. To understand what Jesus taught about the relevance and authority of the Old Testament for his followers, we'll look briefly into two sides of his teaching. We'll start with some passages that often appear to be negative comments Jesus made about the Old Testament, and then we'll examine his clearly positive affirmations of the Old Testament's relevance. Let's begin with some of Jesus' comments that many interpreters have taken as negative outlooks on the Old Testament. Most of us are familiar with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. At one point in this sermon, Jesus touched on several ethical issues. His approach to these issues has left many well-meaning believers with the impression that Jesus opposed or corrected the teachings of the Old Testament. Listen to these familiar passages. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 and 22, we read these words about murder. "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." In Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28, Jesus referred to adultery in this way. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." In Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32, he spoke of divorce. It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 and 34, we see the pattern again as Jesus addressed oaths. "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn.' But I say to you, do not take an oath at all." Jesus also spoke of revenge in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 and 39. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And finally, Christ addressed the issue of love for enemies in this way in Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 and 44. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. All followers of Christ should agree that Jesus is God's supreme revelation and that his teachings were much fuller than the teachings of the Old Testament. He penetrated to the heart and expanded to the farthest horizons in ways that the Old Testament never reached. But unfortunately, many Christians have concluded that Jesus' view on murder, adultery, divorce, oaths, revenge, and love for enemies actually contradicted the Old Testament.
Many believers mistakenly believe that Jesus rejected Old Testament teachings in favor of his own more comprehensive instructions. Now, if this popular outlook is anywhere near the truth, then we have good reason to think that Jesus came to turn us away from the ethical authority of the Old Testament. But when we reflect more closely on what Jesus actually said in Matthew chapter 5, we discover that this outlook is far from adequate. Jesus didn't contradict any of the Old Testament in any way. Rather, he affirmed its authority and contradicted common misunderstandings of the Old Testament in his day.
Instead of disagreeing with the Old Testament, Jesus objected to the ways that many scribes and Pharisees interpreted the Old Testament in his day. At the time of Jesus, few people had direct access to the Bible. For this reason, ordinary people in Israel relied heavily on the oral instructions of their religious leaders. But rather than teaching from the Old Testament itself, the scribes and Pharisees often based their instruction on traditions they had added to the Old Testament. Sadly, these traditions tended to focus on outward obedience rather than on the condition of the heart, a primary concern in both Jesus' teaching and in the Old Testament. In general terms, Jesus contrasted his own teachings, which were in harmony with the Old Testament, with points of view that had been said and heard. In other words, he was addressing oral traditions. When Jesus and other New Testament figures referred to the Old Testament, they always spoke of what was written or read. And nowhere in the New Testament does Jesus refute anything introduced in that manner. So, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus wasn't disagreeing with what was written in the Old Testament, but rather with the oral traditions perpetuated by other teachers in Israel. In this light, we should look more closely at what Jesus actually said about these oral interpretations.
When Jesus speaks in the Sermon on the Mount using this phrase, you have heard it said, but I say to you, he was not saying that the Old Testament law is now being nullified. In fact, he says quite the opposite very explicitly, that I have come to fulfill the law. But what Jesus is doing is he's using a well-known rabbinic technique that teachers of the law would use to talk about their own teaching authority. You've heard different people in the tradition say these things about the teachings of the law, but I say to you, and that comes with a present authority, with an additional authority. And so Jesus is establishing his teaching authority with this well-known teaching technique, not to discount the Old Testament law, but to say something very important theologically and Christologically, that it's important to interpret the Old Testament law in relation to me and to my teaching of the law.
Let's think again about the contrasts that Jesus drew. With respect to the issue of murder, many people believe that Jesus expanded the prohibition against murder to include hatred. But it's important to realize that the Old Testament not only condemned murder, it also condemned discord among God's people. The ideal of harmony and peace among God's people is expressed well in Psalm 133 verse 1 that says, "How good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity." Popular traditions in Jesus' day excused hatred and discord among the Jews, so long as they didn't lead to physical murder. By contrast, Jesus reasserted the actual Old Testament standards by associating the prohibition against murder with the prohibition against hatred. Regarding adultery, many people mistakenly believe that Jesus went beyond the Old Testament prohibition against physical adultery to include adultery of the heart. But in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, the 10th commandment states, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." Here, the Old Testament explicitly prohibited coveting someone's spouse. In other words, adultery of the heart. Jesus' argument was not a denial of Old Testament law, but a reassertion of it. With respect to divorce, in Jesus' day, many religious leaders in Israel believed that a man could divorce his wife for practically any cause. They taught that Old Testament legislation gave them this right, so long as they issued proper legal papers. But the Old Testament indicates clearly that God did not approve of such behavior. As we read in Malachi chapter 2, verse 16, "I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel." In Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 9, Jesus explained his position on divorce in more detail. There, he made it clear that his opposition to divorce was based on the Old Testament itself, particularly on the creation narrative involving Adam and Eve. Regarding the practice of taking oaths, some rabbis in Jesus' day taught that lying was permitted so long as one did not swear to keep his word. Jesus disagreed with this teaching and insisted that the Old Testament prohibited all lying, not just lies that violate oaths. For instance, Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 and 17 begins, "There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue." This is why Jesus went on to say in Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, "Let what you say be simply yes or no." Jesus didn't disagree with the Old Testament, but showed that the oral traditions of the scribes and Pharisees fell short of Old Testament standards. Concerning revenge, the original Old Testament legislation about eye for eye in Exodus chapter 21, verse 24, had been taken in Jesus' day as God's approval of personal revenge. It was believed that every time anyone did anything wrong to you, you had a right to do something equally harmful to them. But originally, eye for eye was part of Moses' legislation for judges. It was designed to guide judges in the official courts of Israel. As in our own day, judges were to render their verdicts and punishments fairly and proportionally to the crimes committed. Moses didn't intend for this standard to apply to interpersonal affairs. Instead, the Old Testament taught that kindness and mercy were to guide behavior for ordinary daily life. As Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18 says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people. I am the Lord." Jesus disagreed with the false interpretation of a law that was intended for judges to follow in their courts, and he affirmed the Old Testament teaching that we are to show kindness in interpersonal relationships. Finally, regarding love for enemies, some teachers in Jesus' day taught that it was acceptable to hate their enemies. They apparently inferred from the commandment of Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, "Love your neighbor as yourself," that it was equally appropriate to hate your enemies. But the Old Testament encourages us to love our enemies. For instance, in Exodus chapter 23, verse 4, we read, "If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him." So, as we've just seen, Jesus didn't contrast his own views with those of the Old Testament. Instead, he opposed the false interpretations of his day and reasserted the true teachings of the Old Testament.
When Jesus presents these "you have heard that it was said, but now I tell you" statements in the Sermon on the Mount, I think that the best way to look at this is that Jesus is getting at the true meaning of the law. Not that he's introducing something new, but that he's expositing, in a sense, what God was aiming at all along. So that when the law says, "You shall not commit adultery," God never intended his people to think that they could get away with looking lustfully at women who were not their wives, or even looking lustfully at their own wives. So Jesus is not introducing a new requirement. He's making plain what's already inherent in the law.
Now that we've looked at a few of Jesus' teachings that many wrongly regard as Jesus' negative comments about the Old Testament, we should turn to several passages in which Jesus made positive affirmations of the Old Testament's authority and relevance for everyone who follows him. Listen to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 and 18. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Here, Jesus insisted that he did not come to do away with the law or the prophets, a common way to refer to the entire Old Testament in the first century. In fact, we can translate the opening of verse 17 not simply as "do not think," but as "do not even begin to think." So when Jesus went on to say that even the smallest letter or stroke of the law will remain in force until all is accomplished, he fully affirmed the Old Testament scriptures. Unfortunately, many Christians read these verses and think that Jesus meant something like, "I have not come to get rid of the Old Testament, but to render it irrelevant." But this was hardly the case. Listen to the words Jesus spoke next in Matthew chapter 5, verse 19. "Whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Notice what Jesus said in this passage. If people fail to keep, or if they encourage others to ignore even the least of the commandments, they will be least in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever keeps and teaches others to keep even the least of the commandments will be great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus knew something about the Jews in his day that's true of believers today as well. We all tend to be very selective in applying the Old Testament to our lives. We tend to pay attention to those parts that we like and ignore or even reject those parts that we don't like. But Jesus insisted that his disciples should affirm and follow every detail of the entire Old Testament, not just some parts of it. Listen to the way he put it in Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. "I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Followers of Christ must not fall into the hypocrisy of claiming to believe that the Old Testament is the Word of God, but failing to obey it.